Hi, this is Rachel from the Book Mavens, and today I'm going to do a book review on 1,000 Ships by Natalie Hines, I think is how we pronounce her name. This is my second to last book that I read for my kind of Greece adventure for the summer. The only book that I had left on that list to finish is The North Wind, which I started but haven't finished because I got home I think like 2 o'clock Monday morning and I'm still recovering and want to spend time with my family. So I will eventually finish that book probably sometime this week and put up a review of that one as well. But this one I really wanted to do a solid review on because I enjoyed it so much. Some background for me regarding all of the Greek mythology stuff is that's a topic that I really like. When I was in college, I took a classical mythology course and really enjoyed it. I've always enjoyed reading myths, whether it's Nordic myths, Greek myths, anything Native American stories, origin stories. I love it all. I think it's always an interesting thing to learn about a specific culture, interpretation of life, because that's what myths are. They're explanations for why we are the way we are. So that's why so many Greek gods and goddesses have humanistic qualities, to explain why we exist, why we are, like I said, the way we are, and also to explain the natural world. And I think the interpretations are always so interesting. As someone who is not particularly religious, I don't really value one explanation over another. And I do think it's interesting how recycled a lot of the ideas are. Like, for example, the Noah's Ark story, right? Every culture is a universal story regarding this just kind of worldwide flood. And I think it's very interesting to read people's interpretations for why that happened. And just fascinating stuff. So anyway, I digress. To get back to this book, 1,000 Ships. So this author, Natalie Hines, wanted to provide an interpretation of the events kind of before Homer's Iliad, during the Iliad, and after the Iliad, specifically that decade after, so thinking Odysseus' journey home, right? Through the eyes of the women. Now, you guys, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you know that I have a very strong perspective when it comes to women's stories. I find them to be incredibly important, and we're so marginalized through the historical lens in terms of what women contributed. I do believe in this whole idea that, you know, behind great men, there were always women. There were always women. Women are just as intelligent or just as capable of anything that a man is able to do. And that's not just for modern women. That's been women this entire time, right? So I really enjoyed this. And if we're talking about Greek women, Trojan women, Spartan women, when we talk about Greek, we're talking primarily, I think, well, if we're going back from a historical lens, we're looking at Greek city-states, right? So we're talking about all these different city-states like Ithaca, right? So you have all of these kings. So if you're familiar, just to give you some background regarding the Iliad and why it started, right? So everybody is familiar, I think, with the myth, right? With the golden apple that Eris, the goddess of kind of mischief and mayhem, had kind of rolled to the feet of our three main goddesses, right? Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera, and that they were battling over who the fairest was because the apple was inscribed with "to the fairest." So they were trying to figure out who that was, and they couldn't. And so they were sent to Paris, who has his own backstory regarding Troy and a prophecy made that he would be the downfall of Troy. And he is challenged to make that decision among these goddesses, right? Talk about a pressure cooker of a situation. So Hera promises him power, right? To rule, to be a great leader, because she's queen of the gods, right? Athena promises him just military glory and prowess, to be this great strategist, and all of her gifts of intelligence, right? That kind of glory and power. Where Aphrodite promises him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. So of course, he chooses the woman, right? So Aphrodite wins the apple. They all go home in a huff. and obviously choose some sides in this war. We know Athena is a goddess who in the story is always preferred and kind of guided along Odysseus because he was so clever, right? So we know, of course, Athena is going to come out on the side of the Greeks. Hera was kind of all over the place. And but Aphrodite also all over the place. But I still have my boarding pass in here. I did finish this on my way home on the plane. What I really enjoyed about this is, yes, it talks about the goddesses and about their selfishness, which I think a lot of us see in the majority of the myths, like Zeus. I mean, all he did was hound after women who didn't want him, right? Or who wouldn't want him based on the level of punishment they were going to receive from Hera, right? Hera is supposed to be the queen of the gods and goddess of marriage and all of these things, but she spends the majority of her time hunting down Zeus's lovers. And if she can't punish the lovers, she punishes the children. Heracles or Hercules being a prime example of that, right? So we do get goddess perspective. The way the story is organized is you have these chapters and you get the perspective of the Trojan women. You get the perspective of the Greek women. Penelope's chapters in particular are amazing. And I'll talk about those in depth in just a second. But so this whole thing is that you have a poet, a storyteller, right? And he is looking for guidance from one of, I think it's Calliope, from one of the muses, and for, to tell these stories. And that Calliope, that this muse decides she's going to influence him to tell the stories of the women. And it's just such an interesting perspective because you just don't hear about them. And through any war, we know that women are always the ones who are kind of left holding the bag, right? They're the ones who lose their husbands. They're the ones who lose their sons. And they're the ones who pay a tremendous price if it's rape or having their lands taken from them, being powerless, enslaved. It's the women. And I really like this. I do recommend this. I think this was such an interesting interpretation. Like the chapters where she's talking about Penelope. So we're starting with like the beginning, leading up to the Iliad and the battle at Troy, which lasts for 10 years. And then the following 10 years. So throughout that we have Penelope where her chapters are her kind of writing to her husband. It's written kind of like almost like a diary entry, just her kind of tracking the time and what's happening. It's very interesting. It's a great narrative tool to kind of progress where we are that she uses in this. It's wonderful. And Penelope is talking about initially Odysseus and how he ends up at war. Odysseus didn't want to fight, right? Odysseus was kind of forced to do so because of Helen. All right, so Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, right? We all know that, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, why this is happening, this war, why they were able to get all of these Greeks to go help Menelaus track down his, wife who left him from another man. It seems kind of silly. Why would he get all of this support, right? Women weren't valued anyway. And it's because Helen's father, when she had all of these suitors from all of these powerful men all over Greece, right, vying for her hand in marriage, that he made them all promise that whoever wins her hand, that he could call upon all of them for aid at any point in time. And he thought that if one of them tried to fight to get her, that the rest of them would have to side with the husband, and that it would be kind of a preventative to war, right? Makes sense. I get it. Well, so when Menelaus' wife, Helen, is taken, because he's the one who wins her hand, right? And this is in Sparta, that he's able to call upon all of her suitors. And at one point in time, Odysseus was a suitor of Helen. And he ends up marrying her sister, Penelope. It's a whole other story. But Penelope is known for being very clever and wise. And she waits 20 years for her husband to come home from this war, right? So her interpretation of these events is just fascinating, because there's a passive-aggressive tone where she is the supportive wife, the patient wife waiting for her husband to come home, but she's also critically analyzing the decisions that he's making that kind of lead to his own folly. It's so interesting and I love it. It's so kind of sneaky to do it that way, and I found it to be very enjoyable. So this whole thing, like, so Odysseus doesn't want to go to war, right? I said that. And so he's pretending to be crazy. So when Agamemnon, who is the brother of Menelaus, and he's the one gathering all of these forces, see, most historians know that there's a grain of truth here, right? Somewhere in there. But most people think that Agamemnon was more motivated for war because Troy was a rich city. There were lots and lots of gold there. And that, that getting Helen was just an excuse to sack the city and to get support to do so. So anyway, so they're tracking down Odysseus. Odysseus pretends to be crazy to try and get out of fighting. So he's out there sowing his fields in Ithaca, which is just like this rocky island. It's not considered particularly valuable, but he's valuable because of his cleverness, right? So he's out there sowing his fields with salt and just like being just acting crazy. And so they take his newborn son and place him in front of the plow. All right, this little hand plow, whatever it is that he's using to sow salt. And they kind of were testing him that if he was really crazy, he would have no problem slicing his baby to ribbons, you know, because who cares about an innocent child, right? In Greek mythology, nobody cares about them. And that he wouldn't be able to do it because obviously Agamemnon does not think that he's crazy. And so Odysseus cannot kill his own child, right? So he stops, the jig is up, and he has to go to war. Well, Penelope's interpretation of it is fascinating. She says, you know, Odysseus, like she's talking to him in these letters and is saying, you know, you could have played this another way. Why not turn the plow on yourself? Slice your feet into ribbons. Like, would have served two purposes. It would still show that there's some level of crazy to commit an act of self-harm, right? Or that you will have destroyed your feet and therefore cannot fight in a war. So she's saying that there were other options. And Odysseus takes one where he preserves himself. And that's kind of a continuous thread you see with her letters throughout the book, where Odysseus makes decisions that benefit him, that he doesn't take into consideration others. So in his whole journey, so we're looking at the Iliad and then also parts of the Odyssey, right? Him trying to return home. And he spends 10 years trying to return home. But he makes decisions that cost him all of his men. So all of these men who've been fighting for a decade never make it home to Ithaca. It's such a tragedy. He's the only one to make it back to Ithaca in the end, right? And her interpretations after she hears, because bards have heard in different lands and they're traveling around, storytellers, so she's hearing about his adventures and misadventures all over Greece, trying to make it back to their small island. And as someone who's married, I don't really have a whole lot of forgiveness for somebody who makes an active decision to just chill with an enchantress for over a year. Like, I'm just gonna hang out there. So he openly has this affair with a beautiful enchantress, and she's just waiting at home, you know, and several years pass, the suitors show up, right, and they're all vying for her hand, and her being the clever one, you know, she's weaving that funeral shroud, right, that when she's done, then she will choose a husband out of all of these suitors. And it's also a really great interpretation that all of these suitors are very young, right? These are the boys who were too young to go fight or who were born after and are looking for ways to prove themselves. Their fathers are gone, so they're boorish and destructive. But she also mentions this idea that maybe all of the suitors aren't terrible, that there's one who treats her with kindness. And if you know the Odyssey, when I feel like, you know, it's been a long time since that story's been around, that if you haven't discovered the ending, I don't really feel like I should worry about spoilers. But, you know, he comes in and through this kind of trick with stringing this bow, and now he's armed, that he takes out all of the suitors and the maids who were thought that they were conspiring. I mean, just wipes out everyone. And Penelope, being this practical person, is like, you know, they really weren't all bad. And she's thinking about the one suitor that she probably could have had some happiness. And then she even doubts over whether or not Odysseus is real. And she's talking about, not real, but is it really the Odysseus? It's been 20 years. And how she's going to test him later. It's just so fascinating, the interpretation this author chose when talking about this. And then, of course, you have some really great revenge stories, right? These women, just the endings that they get. Are they happy endings? Does Penelope really, does her story end happily, having to wait 20 years for a husband who made every decision possible to keep him from her? Is that a happy ending? A lot of people claim that it is, right? In antiquity. But that's not a happy ending. That's not the ending I would have wanted. I would have wanted her to be able to get over it and say, okay, well, I guess this dude's not coming back. He's found himself an enchantress on an island. Look at this really hot young guy who treats me with respect. Maybe I ought to go that direction. You know, like, I don't know. That's just me. But, sorry, my husband has all 3 kids out there. So if you ever hear all the noises, my boys are very boisterous and they're running around and they scream and yell. Sorry about that. They're brothers, they fight. And anyway, with this, is just fascinating. Like, you have Clytemnestra in here, remember? So she's Agamemnon's wife, and Agamemnon has been known in the Iliad for pissing off the gods all the time, particularly Apollo. And Apollo will not let the winds come to sail all of the Greek ships to Troy. So this is the very, very beginning, before the war has even started. And so he sacrifices his daughter, like literally slits her throat to appease Apollo, right? And that the winds come. But he tricks his wife. Now, as a mother with children, so disturbing. He tells his wife, I have arranged this great marriage with the greatest warrior, Achilles or Achilles, depending on how far back you want to go regarding pronunciation. That, you know, I made this great marriage for Iphigenia, that's her name, the daughter. And I want you to come meet us before we sail away for this marriage, right? So Iphigenia comes and she's this young girl and she's so excited, and she's been told that Achilles or Achilles is beautiful, and he's been known to like a golden god, right? And so she's in her wedding garb, and literally soldiers are holding her mother. Wow, I mean, I could just imagine. And it's always depicted that way, where she is crying, tearing her face. That's something that Greek women do when they suffer a loss. They strip the skin from their face. They kind of disfigure themselves. And has to watch while her husband, the father of her child, slits her throat for a war that doesn't need to happen. You feel it. It's so visceral. And that the helplessness, right? Well, Clytemnestra doesn't stay helpless. She finds a lover. She waits. She knows the war is going to end at some point and Agamemnon's going to come home, right? So she kills him as he's getting ready for bed, or for a bath. And I'm not sorry that happens. I think that it's totally a-okay. But you also hear the perspective from the Trojan women, like the Trojan queen and the daughter, Machi. I always butcher her name, but the wife of Hector, and her baby's taken from her and smashed to death against the walls of Troy. And so you get to see her perspective in terms of being so overwhelmed with grief, losing her husband, and then her baby's taken from her and is enslaved by Achilles' son, actually, and making this decision to live. And not necessarily in happiness, but that enough life remains to want to keep going. And what that life looks like, kind of like this half-life of moments of happiness, but not true happiness. And having another child, and what that relationship is compared to what she lost with this other child that she had that was killed. And having to live with the man who is the son of the man who killed her husband, you know, who killed her child, her sister, Polysena. So it's just fascinating how strong women are in antiquity and today to survive, that women at these times just had such tremendous survival instincts. And it is told so well in this book. I really recommend it. It is such a fast read. You're absorbed into these decisions women have, or lack of decisions, and just how they survive. And it's remarkable. And I very much recommend this. This, out of all of the reads that I had for Greece, this was certainly the one of most quality. As you guys already heard from my review of like Katie Roberts' books, those are not for me. This is not a romance in any stretch of the imagination, but it is, the interpretation is so worth it. And I really recommend someone's in trouble. I really recommend this book, and I hope that you will take an opportunity to read this. And if anybody who's interested in getting into Greek mythology, I wouldn't start with something like this. This is, to me, is more of like an advanced read of somebody who's already familiar with the original story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, to be able to understand these interpretations, because I think it's important to have that depth of knowledge first. For anybody who's interested in Greek mythology, I highly recommend that you read Edith Hamilton's Greek mythology. It's unbiased, it's not interpretive, it's a translation and explanation of all of the gods and goddesses and all of the basic Greek myths and everything. And it's a wonderful resource. And I think you should start there and then read the Iliad and the Odyssey and then read this. I would compare this like to something like Madeline Miller's Circe or Song of Achilles, right? So we know that there are many Greek interpretations, like Greek myth interpretations and stories out there. But this, I just love it because it's so focused on the women, similar to what we see with Circe, right? And I think it's worth it. I like this more than I like Song of Achilles. I put this kind of on, because Circe is more of a story. This is a story too. I mean, there's a common thread, but this is so individualized with all of these women. It's a little different. To me, this is more like a collection of short stories. It's just fabulous. And so I do recommend this. And I'm going to close this out as I ramble some more about this book. But I look forward to seeing you guys next time. I think Amanda and I are going to start filming together. So we should have something together for you for next Tuesday. So I look forward to seeing you then.